Celeste Mercer stood before the locked gates of Detroit's most storied auto plant, watching a crew tear the Mercer Motors sign from the wall in a cold, steady rain. The investors who had once called her a visionary walked past without a glance. The board had gone silent, and the press had already written its verdict: the woman who killed a 100-year brand. Every person she had trusted was gone, and every door that had once opened on her family's name was now bolted shut. Then a man in an oil-stained jacket climbed down from an old work truck, looked at her without pity or judgment, and said 2 words: "I'll help." Stay until the end to find out what a single dad mechanic had been hiding in his old shop that could save everything Celeste had lost. The rain had been falling since before sunrise, and by the time the last of the equipment trucks rolled through the gates of the Mercer Motors main plant on the east edge of Detroit, the blacktop was slick with oil and standing water, reflecting back a gray sky that seemed to press down on everything it touched. Workers in coveralls moved in silence, not looking at the building they were leaving for the last time, their expressions carrying the particular flatness of people who had spent their last emotional reserves days ago and were now simply moving through the motions of an ending. The plant had operated for over 90 years, had employed generations of Detroit families whose names were woven into its history like seams in a chassis, and now it was being stripped down and locked up while lawyers finalized what accountants had already decided months ago. Celeste Mercer stood on the far side of the street with no umbrella and no assistant, watching her family's company disappear behind a chain-link fence, not pretending she had seen it coming, or that she had a plan to undo it. The board had voted unanimously to accept the bankruptcy filing and authorize the liquidation of Mercer's primary assets, a decision framed as the only responsible option, as the kind of hard choice that real leaders make. And none of those framings made it easier to understand that the company her father had built from a 2-bay garage in 1963 was now legally dead. Vaughn Mercer appeared from across the parking lot in a charcoal suit, his expression arranged into the careful performance of regret that Celeste had been watching him practice for the better part of 3 years. He told her it was time to sign the departure agreement, that holding on would only cause more damage to the people already hurt, that their father would have understood the limits of what any one person could do against market forces and bad timing. Standing beside him was Garrett Holloway, the board's legal strategist, who added his own quiet observation that if Celeste continued to resist the terms, she would face a string of personal liability suits that would follow her out of the industry entirely. The 2 of them spoke with the calm authority of people who had already won and were simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up, and Celeste said nothing, because she had already said everything she knew how to say inside the boardroom, and none of it had mattered. Vaughn reminded her, gently but with the practiced precision of a man who understood where wounds were deepest, that the longer she fought a conclusion already written, the more she dishonored what Warren Mercer had spent his life building, and the name landed exactly as he intended it to, sharp and settling, before he turned and walked away. Warren Mercer had started Mercer Motors with a used floor jack and a handshake loan from a hardware merchant who believed a young engineer could build a better American automobile than anything currently rolling off a Detroit assembly line, and for 30 years he had kept that promise in ways that made the company a point of genuine pride rather than just a brand slogan. Celeste had grown up understanding the company as an inherited responsibility, a commitment she owed to the workers who had given their careers to the Mercer name and to the father who had trusted her to carry it forward. She had spent 4 years as CEO trying to modernize the engineering pipeline, cut inefficiencies, and build a new generation of vehicles without losing what the name stood for, and then the crisis had come. A product defect story that exploded across the business press, a financial irregularity that no one could fully explain, a series of investor withdrawals with the domino logic of a controlled demolition. The worst part was not the public humiliation or the professional ruin, but the private certainty that she had failed her father's memory, that she had been given something irreplaceable and had let it be taken. When the old work truck pulled to the curb, she barely registered it. A late-model domestic pickup with a cracked mirror and a twice-repaired bumper, and the man who stepped down moved with the unhurried ease of someone who had decided what he was going to do before he got out and was simply carrying out the plan. He had a mechanic's hands and a mechanic's posture, the particular combination of patience and physical steadiness that comes from years of working on problems that cannot be solved by talking about them. And he looked at Celeste the way you look at something you already know how to fix. He glanced once at the Mercer Motors sign being lowered from above the gate, studied it the way a doctor studies a chart, and then turned back to her and said, "I'll help." Celeste almost laughed and asked what exactly a small shop mechanic planned to do to help her recover a company that had just been declared legally bankrupt. Sawyer Langley looked at her without flinching and said, "Not with what they left in the conference room. With what your father didn't." Celeste had not survived 3 decades in a family business by trusting strangers who appeared at convenient moments, and she told Sawyer this with the directness of a woman who had used up her patience for theater. She wanted to know what he wanted: a finder's fee, a salvage contract, access to decommissioned parts inventory, because there was always something, and people who offered help in the most casual language were often the ones who had done the most careful arithmetic beforehand. Sawyer said he didn't want anything from Mercer Motors because Mercer Motors was already gone, at least for now, and that what he was offering came from a promise his father had made to a man who had believed promises still meant something even after lawyers started getting involved. She told him that if he had something real, he should say what it was, instead of packaging it in free mystery, because she was standing in the rain after the worst day of her professional life and did not have the capacity for riddles. Sawyer nodded, accepting this as reasonable, and said that what he had couldn't be explained on the street. It needed to be seen, and that if she still didn't believe him after she saw it, she could leave and he would never mention it again. Before Celeste could respond, her phone buzzed with a call from Delaney Brooks, her former personal attorney who had pulled back from the case months earlier when the board's lawyers had made the proceedings increasingly hostile. Delaney was calling to advise strongly against following any strangers anywhere, to remind her that she was a liability target, and to ask where she was. Celeste told her she was talking to a mechanic named Sawyer Langley. The line went briefly quiet before Delaney asked her to repeat the name, and then the quiet became something different, not the silence of someone who didn't recognize the name, but the silence of someone who did. Celeste agreed to go, and the decision was less about trust than about the arithmetic of available options, which had recently narrowed to nearly nothing. She rode in the passenger seat of Sawyer's truck while he called home to tell his daughter he would be late, speaking with the ease of a man who had been managing that scheduling problem alone long enough that it had stopped feeling like a problem and started feeling like just the shape of his life. A child's voice asked if he was fixing a car, and Sawyer glanced at Celeste before answering, "Might be something bigger than a car," and Celeste heard it and said nothing, watching the Detroit streets give way to narrower roads and older buildings until the truck turned off the main road and a yellow-lit sign came into view through the rain: Langley Motor Works. The shop was small, worn, and entirely without pretense. Dark brick walls repaired in sections, a rolling metal door scratched at the base from decades of use, a single exterior light that cast more yellow than white, and the particular smell that settles into any building that has been working with oil and metal and old wood long enough for the smell to become structural. Celeste had spent 4 years touring engineering facilities specifically designed to convey technological confidence, places with polished concrete and laboratory-grade lighting, and she understood instinctively how to read those spaces, what they were telling you, and what they were hiding. This shop was not telling her anything except that someone had worked here for a very long time, and that the work had been real. She stepped inside without speaking, but Sawyer read her expression the way mechanics read a car, not as a judgment to dispute but as data to account for, and said without looking at her, "A lot of people come in here and see rust. They forget rust only forms on things that lasted." A girl's voice called from the loft above, and Sawyer called back that he'd be inside shortly, keeping his voice easy and steady in the way single parents learn to do when managing two separate worlds at the same time, and neither one is allowed to destabilize the other. Piper, 8 years old, leaned briefly over the railing to look at Celeste with the frank curiosity of a child who has grown up around enough different kinds of adults to know that most of them are more interesting than they first appear, said hello, and went back upstairs. And Celeste understood with quiet force that Sawyer was not a man with resources or connections or leverage. He was a man with a daughter and a shop, and a promise he had decided to keep. Sawyer led her to the back of the building, past organized workbenches and vehicles, in various stages of restoration, to a wooden door heavier and more carefully maintained than everything around it, fitted with a lock that was old but not neglected. He took a key from the bottom drawer of his father's old toolbox, the kind of deliberate movement that made it clear this was not the first time he had moved through these exact steps, only that this was the first time they had reached their conclusion. He said before he turned the key, "Your father knew things he couldn't put in writing anywhere. Vaughn might find them." This was the other way he knew how to leave a record. The back room was cleaner than the rest of the shop, the air still, the kind of atmosphere that accumulates in spaces that are carefully tended rather than constantly worked. In the center of the space, sitting on 4 properly inflated tires set on clean wooden boards, was a form under a gray canvas tarp, low and long, with a silhouette that even under cover communicated something deliberate about the way it had been designed, a car made to look like it was moving even when it wasn't. Sawyer pulled the canvas back in a single motion. The car underneath was a deep cobalt blue that had aged into something almost sapphire, with chrome trim along the roofline and a front grille that swept back at an angle no one used anymore because the aerodynamic models had made it obsolete, and at the center of the steering wheel was a silver compass, the original Mercer emblem, the one her father had used for only the first 2 years before the company's marketing team replaced it with something modern. Celeste had seen that compass in exactly one photograph, a faded print that had sat on her father's desk until the day he died. She was looking at the Mercer Roadcrest Prototype 1, the car her father had built before Mercer Motors was a company, the car that every official record said had been destroyed in a shop fire 31 years ago. Her hand moved toward the hood almost without her telling it to, and she stopped herself. Sawyer said quietly, "That's where it started," long before the board ever got involved. Sawyer told her about his father, Lawson Langley, not with the cadence of a man revealing a secret, but in the straightforward manner of someone relating family history that had shaped everything else. Lawson had been Warren Mercer's first true craftsman, arriving at the original Mercer garage when Warren was still an engineer with a blueprint and a conviction rather than a business, and staying through every stage of the company's growth because he believed Warren was building something that deserved to be built. They had worked together on the Roadcrest Prototype 1 for the better part of 18 months, Lawson doing the fabrication and alignment, while Warren handled the engineering, developing the kind of professional understanding that forms between people who are solving a hard problem together and have decided they are not going to leave until it is solved. Warren always described the prototype as the argument, the physical proof that a small American manufacturer could compete on quality rather than scale, and Lawson understood this perfectly because he was the one whose hands had made the argument real. As Mercer Motors grew into a company with investors and a board and a legal structure, the gap between what Warren had intended and what the company was becoming began to widen. Vaughn had come onto the board 10 years in, first as a minority shareholder, and then, through procedural moves, Warren had approved without fully modeling their consequences, as a structural co-equal with influence over financial direction. What Warren had believed was family loyalty turned out to be something more transactional. Vaughn loved the Mercer name the way a developer loves an old building for what it could be converted into, rather than for what it was. By the time Warren understood this clearly, the governance structure made it difficult to simply reverse, and the illness that found him in his early 70s made the time for correction shorter than he had hoped. He had made arrangements, but he had made them carefully, knowing that any document filed through official channels would pass through processes Vaughn's people monitored, so the arrangements he trusted most were the ones that left the official record entirely. Inside the Roadcrest's interior, secured behind a false panel beneath the rear passenger seat, was a small steel lockbox that could not be opened with any conventional key. Sawyer explained that the box used a combination of a physical key his father had kept and a biometric element coded to Warren's direct bloodline, which meant it was coded to Celeste. She looked at him for a long moment, as though assessing the probability of this being true, and then she placed her right hand on the silver compass at the center of the steering wheel, and a small indicator light along the base of the box shifted from amber to green. The box clicked open. Inside was a rolled data storage cylinder, several legal documents in a protective sleeve, and a handwritten letter addressed to Celeste in her father's handwriting. She did not open the letter immediately. She sat in the front seat of the prototype in silence, and Sawyer stood outside the car and let her have it. Sawyer's shop had a data reader that belonged to the same generation as the storage cylinder, an older diagnostic machine that Warren had apparently known would still be serviceable in shops like this one, where equipment was maintained because it worked rather than replaced because it was new. The cylinder loaded without difficulty, and the monitor came to life with an image of Warren Mercer that Celeste had not been prepared for. Her father, older than the last photograph she had of him, sitting in the same back room she was standing in now, speaking directly into the camera with the deliberate calm of a man who has thought very carefully about every word he is about to say. Warren began by acknowledging what he expected to be true, that if Celeste was watching this, Mercer Motors had reached the edge of something catastrophic, and that she had probably been told, in many different ways, by many different people, that she was the reason the company had reached it. He said he was sorry for what she was carrying, and he said it the way fathers say hard things, without embellishment, looking at the camera as though he could see her. He told her that approximately 4 years before his death he had discovered that Vaughn had been quietly constructing a financial architecture designed to separate the Mercer brand, the name, the logo, the intellectual property, from the actual manufacturing assets. The purpose of this architecture was to create a condition in which, if Mercer Motors ever entered financial distress, Vaughn would be positioned to acquire the brand at a distressed asset valuation while the physical company dissolved around it, leaving him with the name and none of the labor obligations. The reason the collapse had happened so fast, Warren said, was not market timing or bad product decisions. It was because the data supporting the engineering failure had been manipulated. A standard report on a braking system anomaly in one of Mercer's new production vehicles had been altered to characterize what was a correctable calibration error as a fundamental design failure, a distinction that changed everything about how investors interpreted the company's viability. The person who had prepared and certified that report, Warren said clearly, was Garrett Holloway. He had done this at Vaughn's direction, knowing it would cause the investor withdrawal that would accelerate the financial crisis, and he had positioned himself as the board's legal advisor precisely so he could manage the legal aftermath of a collapse he was helping to engineer. The documents in the protective sleeve were the material evidence, the original fund charter for a brand protection trust that Warren had established, giving Celeste the right to block any sale of the Mercer name if she could demonstrate that the conditions triggering the sale had been manufactured. A covenant Vaughn had never known existed because Warren had filed it through a legal structure in another state under a holding name bearing no connection to Mercer Motors. There were also certified copies of internal financial communications stamped and dated that showed the architecture Vaughn had built, and a signed statement from Lawson Langley, made in the presence of a notary 2 months before Lawson died, attesting to everything he had witnessed and been asked to preserve. Celeste opened the letter last. 3 pages in her father's handwriting, and when she finished, she sat in the front seat of the prototype in silence while the rain came down outside and Piper's music drifted faintly from the loft above. Warren had written, "You do not need to save Mercer for me. You only need to decide whether it is still worth saving." Celeste set the letter down on the passenger seat, picked up her phone, and called Delaney Brooks. She said, "I have evidence. I want to take the company back." Delaney arrived at Langley Motor Works just before midnight and moved through the documents with the focused speed of an attorney who had been waiting for the shape of a case to become clear. The Brand Protection Trust documents had real legal teeth, covenant language that would hold in a commercial court if Celeste could establish that the triggering conditions for the bankruptcy had been fraudulently manufactured. The financial communication records were the most dangerous to Vaughn because they had timestamps and internal routing codes, the kind of evidence that didn't require interpretation to understand. But the engineering data manipulation was the structural argument, the piece that would reframe the entire narrative from CEO failed to manage a product crisis to fractured crisis designed to create a forced sale. And for that argument to work, they needed a witness who had been inside the data system when the alterations were made. Warren had mentioned a name in the video, Brielle Dawson, a data engineer who had been part of Mercer's final quality assurance cycle before the braking system report was finalized. A careful, methodical engineer who had left the company right before the scandal broke, with Garrett characterizing her departure as voluntary burnout. They found Brielle working at a small software firm 2 hours outside Detroit, and she met them in a diner parking lot with the guarded expression of someone who had spent 18 months expecting that something would eventually show up and that nothing good would be inside it. She told Celeste she wasn't interested in talking about Mercer, that she had signed a non-disclosure agreement under conditions she still found difficult to describe calmly, and that she had made a decision after leaving the company to build a life that did not involve being a problem for powerful people to solve. Sawyer set a photograph of the prototype one on the table, then the letter with Warren's signature, then the page of the video transcript where Warren had spoken Brielle's name as someone who knew the truth. Brielle looked at the photograph for a long time before she looked up. She said that she had flagged the discrepancy in the braking system data to Garrett directly, that the original log showed a calibration variance their testing protocol marked as correctable within 2 production cycles, and that the version of the report that went to the board described the same variance as a systemic design failure with no viable remediation path. She had written 2 internal memos objecting to the change in characterization, and both had disappeared from the system. 3 days later, Garrett had placed a non-disclosure agreement in front of her, along with a letter characterizing her departure as voluntary, and she had signed both because she was 28 years old and had a mortgage, and had been told clearly that disputing the terms would result in litigation that would cost her more than she had. She had kept a personal copy of the original data log on a private drive. She would testify if Celeste could make sure that Garrett's reach didn't extend to the witness stand. While Celeste assembled evidence at Langley Motor Works, Vaughn was not idle. He had called a meeting of the remaining creditor group and the 2 institutional investors who had not yet finalized their withdrawal, framing it as a rescue operation for a legacy brand that had been mismanaged rather than fundamentally broken. He presented his investment group, described as independent capital with a deep appreciation for American automotive heritage, as the most credible buyer for the Mercer brand assets, the ones that could be separated cleanly from the liabilities of the plant and pension obligations and unresolved warranty claims. The price he offered was structured to look generous against the bankruptcy valuation, while ensuring that the actual transfer price reflected the distressed conditions Vaughn had spent years arranging, and he spoke about his father's legacy with the practiced fluency of a man who had long ago separated what he said about Warren Mercer from what he actually thought about him. Garrett, meanwhile, had noticed that Celeste had not surfaced since the liquidation announcement, and sent a representative to Langley Motor Works on the pretext of conducting a routine inventory of company assets that might have passed into private hands through irregular channels. The representative arrived with a clipboard and an official-looking letter and told Sawyer that he needed access to the premises. Sawyer told him that Langley Motor Works was a private business that had never been part of Mercer's asset structure, and that any claim to the contrary would need to be presented through a court filing with a specific legal basis. Delaney appeared from the back of the shop, asked the man his name, told him that any further communication would need to come in writing addressed to her firm, and walked him to the door. After the representative left, Celeste told Sawyer he didn't have to continue with this. He was a single father with a small business and a daughter upstairs, and the people who had just sent someone to his door had resources that his situation was not designed to withstand. Sawyer was quiet for a moment. The way he was quiet when working through a mechanical problem, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he was making sure the answer he gave was the right one. And then he said, "My father kept this car his entire adult life because your father trusted him with it. I'm not going to be the first person in the Langley family to break a promise." Delaney called from the front of the shop to say that Vaughn had scheduled the brand transfer vote for 48 hours from that moment, and if they didn't get the trust documentation in front of the right people before the vote closed, the window to challenge it under Warren's covenant language would expire. The idea of bringing the Prototype 1 to the board was Delaney's, and she explained it the way she explained legal strategy, in terms of what it would accomplish and why the alternative was weaker. The car was not simply an artifact. It was physical evidence that the official corporate history had been falsified, that the narrative Vaughn had constructed about Warren's legacy was built on a selective record, and that the man who claimed to be honoring his brother's memory had conspired to erase the most important object connected to it. But the prototype had been sitting in a locked room for the better part of a decade, and making a car that old roadworthy in less than 2 days was not a simple task, and the task fell entirely to Sawyer. What followed was the kind of work that has no equivalent in conference rooms or executive suites. The systematic, patient process of returning a machine to life after it has been held in stasis for a very long time. Sawyer moved through the car with the deliberate sequence of someone who thinks about systems as interdependent rather than individual. Fuel lines, ignition, cooling, braking, suspension, each element examined and either confirmed or replaced with period-appropriate parts from a climate-controlled storage section he had spent years curating. Brielle set up her data reader at the workbench. Delaney worked at a folding table covered in documents. Celeste, who had spent the last several years in boardrooms and investor presentations, stood still for a moment and then took off her coat, found a clean cloth, and began wiping 30 years of storage dust from the car's body panels without being asked. Piper came downstairs just before 9 o'clock to say goodnight, carrying a drawing she had made. The prototype in colored pencil, rendered with the combination of technical accuracy and imaginative freedom that belongs to children who have grown up in working spaces, and at the bottom in careful capital letters she had written, "Bring it home." Sawyer propped the drawing against the workbench lamp and looked at it for a long moment, and Celeste saw it too and said nothing, pressing her lips together before she turned back to the car. The first attempt to start the engine produced a low vibration through the chassis and then silence, and Celeste felt the silence as a physical thing. Sawyer crouched beside the engine compartment, listened with his ear close to the valve cover, straightened up and said, "It's not dead. It just doesn't trust the new fuel yet." He spent the next 40 minutes replacing the fuel delivery lines, recalibrating the original carburetor with a tool from his father's kit, and making one additional adjustment to the timing that clearly proceeded from a knowledge of this specific engine rather than from general principles. The second attempt produced something entirely different, a deep, unhurried rumble that moved through the floor and settled in the chest of everyone standing in the shop, an engine note that belonged to a different era when sound was considered part of what you were selling. Celeste stood at the front of the car with both hands at her sides and said nothing, because the sound the prototype one made when it came back to life was not the sound of a machine. It was the sound of her father's voice arriving from somewhere she hadn't expected it. Sawyer closed the hood and said, "Now the company is going to have to look at where it came from." By the time dawn came through the high windows of Langley Motor Works, the garage door was open and the Mercer Roadcrest Prototype 1 rolled out onto the street for the first time in 31 years. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning at Mercer's temporary administrative office, a leased floor in a downtown building chosen for convenience rather than any connection to the company's history. Exactly the kind of space that looked like it could have belonged to anyone, and therefore felt like it already belonged to Vaughn. He had arrived early, organized his documents, and arranged the room with the quiet confidence of a man who understands that the outcome of a meeting is often determined before it begins. The creditor representatives, 2 institutional asset managers, and the remaining independent board members were already seated when Vaughn opened the session by noting that the agenda item was straightforward, approving the brand transfer to the acquiring vehicle, which he described as the most responsible path for preserving whatever value remained in the Mercer name. He heard the engine before the board members did because he was facing the window that looked out onto the front approach, and the sound traveled in a way that didn't match any vehicle currently in production. It was low and precise and unhurried, the note of an engine built when engineers still considered acoustics a design value rather than a problem to be suppressed. It arrived at wide-way history sometimes arrives in a room, without announcing itself and with perfect timing. The Mercer Roadcrest Prototype 1 came into view on the approach road, and the 3 board members old enough to remember the company's early decades rose from their chairs without quite deciding to, because there is a category of recognition that bypasses the decision to react and simply produces the reaction. Vaughn's expression did not change, but the stillness in it became a different kind of stillness. Celeste came through the front doors with Sawyer beside her and Delaney and Brielle behind them, and the woman who walked into that room was not the woman who had stood in the rain 2 days before. She set the trust documents on the boardroom table without ceremony and said that before the vote was recorded, the board needed to hear something that had not been included in any materials they had received through official channels. Vaughn said the car outside was a fabrication, a replica constructed to create a sentimental distraction. Sawyer opened a panel beneath the driver's side dashboard containing the original fabrication record, stamped with dates and material codes, and pointed to a hand stamp in the lower chassis frame, a mark Lawson Langley had made on every car he built, a practice that predated standard identification requirements, and that 3 people in the room recognized immediately as authentic. He also opened the hood and directed the board's attention to a hand-etched signature on the inner firewall in a location accessible only if the engine were fully removed, a detail that would not exist on any replica built to deceive. Brielle presented her testimony in the structured, specific language of a data professional. Here is what the original log showed. Here is the field that was altered. Here is the timestamp of the alteration. Here is the certified copy of the original file she had kept on a private drive since the day she was asked to sign the non-disclosure agreement. Garrett objected loudly that the agreement barred her from disclosing proprietary data, and Delaney placed a second document on the table, a legal opinion establishing that non-disclosure agreements used to conceal fraudulent activity are unenforceable in the relevant jurisdiction, and that the enforcement of such an agreement would itself constitute an independent cause of action. Garrett looked at the document and said nothing more. Celeste played the portion of Warren's video that addressed the board directly, not the personal sections, but the part where her father explained the fund covenant, the purpose of the Brand Protection Trust, and the conditions under which it activated, and the room was very quiet during this, because Warren spoke not about the company as an asset to be managed, but as a commitment made to the people who built it, and about what it would mean to let that commitment be unwound by the people who had never made it. Vaughn said, into the silence that followed, that Warren had died without understanding the demands of the modern market, and that sentiment was not a basis for corporate governance. Celeste looked at her uncle and said, "He didn't know everything about today's market, but he knew you well enough to hide a car from you for 30 years. The board chair said they would need to suspend the vote pending an independent review. The brand transfer was tabled. The investigation into Garrett Holloway and Vaughn Mercer's conduct was formally opened before anyone had left the room. Garrett's response came through the press rather than through legal channels, which told Celeste everything she needed to know about the strength of his position in court. Stories appeared in 2 business publications the same afternoon, describing Celeste's boardroom presentation as a theatrically staged attempt to delay an inevitable insolvency process, characterizing Sawyer as a financially motivated opportunist, and describing Brielle as a disgruntled former employee whose account was contradicted by her own signed agreement. The stories were timed to appear before the independent review committee had been formally seated, clearly intended to shape public perception before anyone with authority could assess the evidence, and Celeste recognized the pattern immediately. It was the same strategy used at the beginning of the crisis, when the braking system story had hit the financial press before the company's technical team had been given a chance to provide context. By the following morning, there were 2 news vehicles parked on the street outside Langley Motor Works, and a photographer had positioned himself at an angle that included Piper's window in the frame, and Celeste watched Sawyer go to the door and address him in a tone that left no room for negotiation. She understood in that moment that what she had drawn Sawyer into was not abstract. It had a child's name and a bedroom window and a father standing at the door defending both. Delaney recommended a formal public presentation of the core evidence, controlled, documented, held at a location of their choosing, that would make any subsequent characterization of the evidence as fabricated look obviously untenable. Celeste's first instinct was to resist, concerned that further public exposure would drive down whatever value remained in the Mercer brand, and she raised this concern the way she had been trained to raise concerns, as a risk calculus. Sawyer was in the corner of the shop working on a brake assembly when she said it, and he didn't look up from the work when he spoke. He said a company that survives by controlling what the public knows about it has already made a fundamental choice about what it is, and that this was the same choice Vaughn and Garrett had been making for years, and that starting over meant starting differently, or it didn't mean anything. Celeste was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "All right. We do it at the shop." The presentation was held at Langley Motor Works, with the prototype one at the center of the space, and the evidence laid out on the workbench in the order it had been gathered, and Celeste told the full story without managing it, where the car had come from, what her father had put inside it, what Brielle had seen, what the documents said. By that evening, the coverage had changed in the way that coverage changes when people sense they've been given the real version of a story. The legal outcomes arrived in sequence rather than all at once, which was consistent with how these things actually worked, rather than how they worked in the version of events Celeste had been carrying in her head during the worst weeks of the crisis. The court issued an emergency injunction blocking the brand transfer pending the independent review, which froze Vaughn's acquisition vehicle and prevented the intellectual property from moving. The financial communications Delaney had submitted were referred to the state attorney's commercial fraud unit, and Garrett Holloway was formally suspended from his advisory role. Vaughn lost his board representation on any decision related to the brand or the trust covenant, a restriction that effectively ended his ability to drive the process he had spent years constructing. But Mercer Motors was still in bankruptcy. The plant was still closed. The workers who had been let go still did not have jobs, and the debts were real, and the creditors were patient only to a point. Celeste worked with a restructuring advisor who agreed to take the case after the investigation changed the narrative, developing a plan that involved selling non-core real estate to satisfy the most time-sensitive obligations, retaining the brand and the core engineering patents, and opening a limited production run of heritage vehicles to generate working capital and demonstrate that the company was operationally alive rather than only legally sustained. She offered Sawyer a formal role in the heritage program, and he declined without any change in expression, and Celeste had expected this. She made a second offer, a formal partnership designation under which Langley Motor Works would become the first officially recognized Mercer Heritage Restoration Facility, with a contract that paid at full market rate and included a historical recognition commitment, ensuring that Lawson Langley and the other original craftsmen who had worked with Warren were written into Mercer's official founding record. Sawyer agreed to this, and Celeste noticed that the only condition he attached was the historical acknowledgement, not the financial terms. She stood in the empty main plant one afternoon with Sawyer beside her, and she said, "I keep thinking it should feel like more of a victory." Sawyer walked the length of the floor with his hands in his pockets and said, "A car doesn't come back to life because you look at it. You have to start tightening one bolt at a time." Celeste said, "Then show me which bolt we start with." The coverage of what had happened at Langley Motor Works spread in the weeks following the boardroom presentation, and Sawyer received inquiries from journalists who wanted to profile him as the mechanic who saved an American brand, from production companies that wanted to document the shop, and from investors who had assembled various frameworks to turn his story into a business opportunity. He declined most with brief, direct notes that gave no indication he was weighing the decision heavily, because he wasn't. He had a daughter who was 8 years old and a shop that had work in it now, and the things that mattered to him about his life were unchanged by the things other people had decided to notice about it. Piper asked him one evening whether they were going to be rich now that he had helped the lady with the car company. Sawyer told her they were a little more comfortable than before because the Mercer partnership contract represented steady work at a rate that took the seasonal pressure off the shop's cash flow. But the more important thing, he told her, was that a car that had been hidden for a very long time had gotten to go outside, and there was something right about that, regardless of the financial outcome. Piper thought about this with the concentrated seriousness she brought to things she found genuinely interesting, and she said she thought that was like how some kids were at school. The ones nobody noticed, who turned out to be the most interesting ones once somebody paid attention. Sawyer looked at her for a moment and said that was exactly right, and he meant it more broadly than she knew. He meant Celeste, defined by a failure that wasn't hers, and Brielle, erased from the record of events she had witnessed, and Lawson Langley, whose name had never appeared in a single line of Mercer's official history, despite the fact that his hands had built the first vehicle the company ever made. Celeste honored the historical recognition agreement without being asked to follow up on it, and the first edition of the reconstituted Mercer Motors historical record included a full section on the founding period that named Lawson Langley and the other original craftsmen, placed the Roadcrest Prototype 1 at the center of the founding story, and corrected a record that had been wrong for a very long time. Several months later, Mercer Motors held the launch of the Roadcrest Legacy program at Langley Motor Works rather than a hotel ballroom, and the decision to hold it at the shop was Celeste's, made without discussion and without polling what various stakeholders would prefer. The shop was clean, but still obviously a shop, still carrying the ambient quality of a place where real work had happened for a long time, and the Mercer Roadcrest Prototype 1 sat the center of the floor the way it had sat for all those years under its canvas cover, except that now the canvas was gone, the lights were on, and people could see it. Celeste spoke briefly, without prepared remarks, and said that Mercer Motors had not been saved by a contract or a capital infusion or a favorable court ruling. It had been saved because one person had kept a promise, and that person had done it in a shop that no one had ever considered important until the moment it turned out to be the only thing that mattered. Vaughn Mercer and Garrett Holloway were not present. The civil cases against both had been filed and were proceeding through the early stages of litigation, and the brand transfer had been permanently blocked under Warren's trust covenant. The company was not recovered. It was recovering, which was a different thing, a process rather than a state, and Celeste had made her peace with the distinction. Sawyer stood at the back of the space with Piper beside him, watching the presentation without any particular need to be at the center of it. Celeste called his name from the front, along with Lawson Langley's and Warren Mercer's and Brielle Dawson's, the people who had carried the truth through the years when carrying it was inconvenient and unwitnessed, and the acknowledgement was specific and unhurried and said what it was meant to say. A new sign had been mounted beside the shop's original name, flush against the brick and lit from below. Langley Motor Works, official Mercer Heritage Partner. After the event, when most people had gone and the shop was quiet again, Celeste stood at the door where she had first seen the Prototype 1's form under the canvas, the same door Sawyer had unlocked with his father's key. She asked him why, on the day that everything had fallen apart, he had stopped his truck at the gate of a bankrupt company and offered to help a woman he had never spoken to. Sawyer looked across the shop to where Piper was running her fingers along the chrome trim of the Prototype 1, tracing the silver compass at the center of the steering wheel with the light touch of someone who understood that some things should be touched carefully. He said, "My father used to say that when a person loses everything, the first thing they need isn't money. It's a door that's still open." Celeste stood in the open doorway of Langley Motor Works, and behind her the first light of the evening came through and fell across the hood of the oldest car the Mercer family had ever made. And for the first time since she had stood outside those locked gates in the cold rain, she felt like something had returned to exactly where it was supposed to be.